In the Book of Esther, there is an incredible story of vindication that many consider to be the greatest coincidence in the Bible. This is because it is rare to witness such a large number of favorable events taking place in such a short period of time. It is important to note that what we refer to as coincidence should be seen as providence. The story is about Mordecai, who is described as the son of Jair from the tribe of Benjamin. After Haman was killed, Mordecai was promoted to vizier. The Book of Esther has more historical evidence records than any other Old Testament book besides the Bible itself. Contemporary Greek historian Herodotus, born in 4 AD BC, confirmed that Esther is a late book. Other sources, such as archaeologists excavating Persepolis, the Persian Empire's capital, have also supported the historical accuracy of Esther. To provide some historical background, Babylon was conquered by the Persian alliance of Darius the Mede, who was succeeded by Xerxes, the first emperor of the new empire, also known as Ahasuerus. Hadassah was a Jewish girl who rose to the position of queen and was given the name Esther, a pagan name short for Ishtar, a Babylonian goddess. As a result, Esther was promoted to positions in which she could help her communities. The story is not a romantic tale of God forcibly returning the Jews to the Promised Land. Instead, it is a love story in which Esther, a young and beautiful queen, ruled over a vast kingdom. Only one man knew her secret, and it was a life-threatening secret. Xerxes ruled a vast empire that stretched from India to Egypt, and danger was looming. He called for a 180-day meeting to explore how he would deal with the Greek threat. At the end of the session, they celebrated with a 7-day feast in the royal grounds. The king asked his wife Vashti to dance for them after they had consumed too much wine. However, Vashti refused to appear, which put the king in an uncomfortable predicament. If he didn't deal with his wife, the general's women would likely follow suit, and something had to be done since they were in danger if he couldn't control his household. He told her she would never be able to return to his presence. However, he found his bed to be a touch cold, and he grew increasingly lonely. Someone suggested that he have a beauty pageant, with the winner becoming his wife. Esther had a year's worth of beauty treatments prior to entering the competition, and she was proclaimed Xerxes' new queen as a result of her victory. In the Book of Esther, we witness a series of extraordinary events that many consider to be a product of divine providence. Esther, a member of the Benjamin tribe and an orphan, rose to become the queen of the Persian Empire after winning a beauty pageant. Despite her inexperience, she quickly became the favorite of King Xerxes. Meanwhile, a man named Haman, who was a descendant of the prophet Agag, became a high-ranking courtier in the empire. He harbored deep animosity towards the Jews, who were distinct with their own laws, traditions, and religion. Haman urged the emperor to have everyone worship him. But when Mordecai, Esther's cousin and adoptive father, refused, he convinced the king to exterminate the Jews. To determine the date of the Jewish people's execution, Haman literally drew lots, and on the 13th day of the month, their fate was sealed. When the Jews found out, they fasted and wore sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai sent a message to Esther begging her to help her people, claiming that God had brought her to the kingdom for a specific purpose. Esther faced a difficult decision. Should she reveal her Jewish identity and risk her own life, or remain silent and allow her people to perish? She ultimately decided to approach the king and propose a banquet with Haman as the honored guest. The king granted her request, and at the meal, Esther revealed Haman's treachery and pleaded for her people's lives. In the end, the king granted her request, and Haman was executed instead. Esther's bravery and quick thinking saved the Jewish people from certain death, and the holiday of Purim was established to commemorate this miraculous event. The story of Esther is a testament to the power of faith, courage, and the belief that even in the darkest of times, miracles can happen. As for Haman, he was seething with anger towards Mordecai, so much so that he constructed a gallows measuring 23 meters high to hang him on. He did not reveal who the gallows were intended for, but his intentions were clear. Despite his fury, Haman managed to contain himself and went home to his wife and friends, boasting about his wealth, numerous children, and the king's many honors bestowed upon him. However, his anger towards Mordecai continued to burn within him, and he expressed his dissatisfaction to his wife and friends. Haman even boasted about being the only one Queen Esther had invited to a royal banquet, but his joy was overshadowed by Mordecai's presence at the king's gate. Haman's wife and friends suggested that he erect a pole reaching a height of 50 cubits and asked the king the following morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Haman was thrilled with this idea and had the pole set up the night before the banquet. Meanwhile, the king suffered from insomnia and decided to read through the Chronicles, where he stumbled upon the record of Mordecai's heroism in foiling an assassination plot against him. The king realized that Mordecai had never been rewarded for this brave act and asked his servants who was in the court at that moment. As it happened, Haman had just entered to request permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had built. As Haman stood in the court, the king summoned him and asked, "What shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" Haman, thinking highly of himself, believed the king was referring to him and suggested dressing the man in a royal robe, placing a crown on his head, and parading him through the city on horseback while proclaiming, "This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." The king agreed and instructed Haman to do so for Mordecai, a Jew who sat at the king's gate. Haman begrudgingly followed the king's orders, but returned home mourning and in sorrow. Haman shared the events with his wife and friends, and they warned him that he would not overcome Mordecai, who was of Jewish heritage. Meanwhile, the king's eunuchs arrived and took Haman to the banquet prepared by Esther. That night, the king read the book detailing Mordecai's actions to save his life, and Haman mistakenly suggested that Mordecai be rewarded, thinking it was for himself. The king honored Mordecai and paraded him through the city in a royal robe on horseback. At the feast, Esther found the courage to speak to the king about her people, and he learned of Haman's plot to harm them. The king had Haman hanged on the gallows he had built for Mordecai, and he and Haman had come to drink wine with Esther on the second day of the feast. Queen Esther was faced with a difficult situation in which she needed to petition King Xerxes to save her life and the lives of her people. She boldly approached the king, knowing that her request could have dire consequences, and asked that her life and the lives of her people be spared. She explained to the king that she and her people had been sold to be destroyed, killed, and wiped out of existence. If they had only been sold as slaves, she would have remained silent, but the current situation was too dire to ignore. King Xerxes asked Esther who was responsible for this atrocity, and she identified Haman as their adversary and enemy. Haman became terrified when he realized that the king was angry with him. As the king went into the palace garden to decide what to do, Haman stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther. However, the king returned and saw Haman falling on the couch where Esther was seated, and he accused him of attempting to assault the queen. The servants then covered Haman's face in preparation for his execution. A fresh decree was published, overriding Haman's orders and guaranteeing the Jews the right to self-defense and the authority to annihilate any armed force that could attack them. This intervention was critical because assassins were waiting to slay all the Jews across the empire. When Haman's edict to exterminate the Jews came to fruition, the Jews were ready and proceeded to defeat their opponents and slay Haman's family. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was carried out. The enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. All the nobles of the provinces, satraps, governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace, and his reputation spread throughout the provinces, making him more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, including Parsandatha, Dalphon, Aspata, and the 10 sons of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. However, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king asked Esther what the Jews had done in the rest of his provinces. He offered to grant her any petition she had, and any request she made would be granted. Esther bravely spoke up to King Xerxes, requesting that he allow the Jews in Susa to carry out the edict of the previous day, and also requested that Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles. The king granted her request, and the 10 sons of Haman were impaled in Susa. If this had not happened, the Jews would have been wiped out, as the Persian Empire spanned from India to Egypt, and the original edict would have been followed. Esther's actions are honored every year through the celebration of Purim. Throughout the tale of Esther, Mordecai's trust in God served as a light of hope for those around him. He was the source of strength for Esther, and his words and deeds revealed a man who was not interested in gaining prestige or following the crowd, but rather standing up alone for what he considered to be God's will. As a result, God showered blessings on Mordecai, reminding others of God's provision for them. Mordecai didn't think much of the plot to kill the king until he learned that the king wanted to reward him with a royal robe and a parade. The blessings from the king continued after Esther exposed Haman's plot, and Mordecai commanded the Jews to protect themselves against their attackers. He was appointed as second in command to the king, and these unexpected blessings from God were not meant to elevate Mordecai, but rather to continue God's mission for peace in the kingdom and continued reliance on God. Mordecai's greatness was published in the entirety of Esther chapter 13. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are written in the book of the annals of the king of Media and Persia. Mordecai, the Jew, was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews.